So we are recording now. Welcome everybody. My name is Chris Price. I'm the Academic Programs Manager for the SUNY Center for Professional Development. This is the third webinar this semester that we've had in the Faculty Development Community of Practice throughout SUNY. This was the first time we've done this series in a little while, and I hope to do another one. And I will introduce this webinar in a minute, but I will say that we are using the Zoom, the webinar version of Zoom, which is a little different than the meetings version that many of you are familiar with. The big difference is that unless I give you permission, you can't use your microphone or video camera. So we have a relatively small group today, so anybody that would like to say out loud a question or participate with their voice, just raise your hand, and you should be able to, when you go on to your name, and there's a way to raise your hand, or you could just put something in the chat. There is also a Q&A section. Let's not use that. Let's just use the chat, and I will be monitoring the chat as we go along and promoting people to talk if you'd like to talk, or I will be mentioning your question. But please don't be shy. Like I said, this is a small enough group that if everybody wants to talk, everybody will have the opportunity to do so. Yeah, the raised hand option should be at the bottom of the screen. I'm in the moderator version, so if you go over your name, you should be able to, yep, okay, you see it, great. And okay, so I just want to thank our presenters today. So it's John Suarez, who's the Service Learning Coordinator and Director of the Institute for Civic Engagement at SUNY Cortland, and Vince DeTuri, the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences, also at SUNY Cortland. And today, John and Vince are going to talk about developing reflection assignments. And we're going to make this a very interactive webinar. So hopefully you didn't just come to hear everybody talk at you. We definitely are encouraging everybody to get engaged and to think, and hopefully you brought an assignment or something that you'd like to work on with your students, or in the case of those of you that aren't teaching, maybe an activity that you do with other instructors if you do professional development workshops and that sort of thing. So with that, I'll turn it over to John and Vince.
All right, great. Thanks, Chris. So welcome, everybody. Glad you could join us today. What we thought we would do is just go through introductions, have everybody introduce themselves very quickly, and really to make this quick, what we need is your name, your title, institution you're from, and then we'd like one-liner, one sentence about your experience with reflection, and then another sentence about what you want to gain out of this webinar.
All right, so folks can put that in the chat, or I'll put my video screen back on, or you can raise your hand and I will promote you to talk.
So
no one wants to talk. Let's see. Oh, somebody wants to talk. Great. A lot of talk. Keith. Thanks, Keith. I assume that's Keith.
Yeah, it's me. I might show up as TLTC Purchase College.
Yeah, yep, you're all set, Keith. Go ahead, we can hear you.
I don't know if the webcam is on or it's just the microphone, but Keith Landa, I'm director of our Teaching Learning Technology Center here at Purchase College. I'm also, I call myself a contributing faculty member in the Environmental Studies program. That's my background, and that's where I get to hang out when I'm pretending to be a faculty member. I teach geology these days. Just set up a reflection assignment for my students to think about the work they did on an open pedagogy chapter project. And I have done some reflective learning workshops for faculty. So I'm interested to see, the way that you all approach it.
great.
Keith, thank you for that. We'll ask you also, because as Chris and Vince have mentioned, this is a kind of a mini community of practice, so we would like to learn from each other.
Good.
Thanks.
So Lori was asking, she lost track of everything we should offer. So we're just doing introductions, who you are, what campus you're on, and what brought you to the webinar today, and what you're interested in learning about with regard to developing reflection assignments. So Anne from Brockport's here. I'll just read it out so that everyone can hear it, and you guys don't have to check the chat. Wendy Miller from SUNY Cortland, who I assume you know, and there's Lori. Okay. Lori's at Geneseo. Lori did our first webinar in the series, which went really well. She's the Assistant Director for Educational Technology, and she helps faculty create assignments. So we are going to get a number of folks like that in this today, some folks that are working with faculty. So they're probably going to take what you do today and then hopefully repackage it for their own campus.
That'd be awesome.
All right, there's Marnie Fitzmaurice from, I guess it's Cornell College of Vet Medicine. She uses reflective exercise after quizzes to help students identify areas of weakness and make a plan for improvement. There's Laura Dubnar from Instructor of Writing at Cortland. Her interest in reflection is connected to the importance we know of reflective writing has for supporting improved writing among students. Sometimes it can be difficult to craft reflection opportunities that move students past the, here's how I felt about this, to here's what I learned from this. Let's see. Anne from Brockport earlier, she's a senior instructional designer at the International Online Curriculum Coordinator. So Anne, many of you know COIL. Anne works a lot with COIL. And she also teaches in the communications department and works with faculty, and many have reflections in their courses. Christy, I'm going to butcher your last name, Christy. I apologize. DeTuri, Division Chair of Business, Social, and Behavioral Sciences at SUNY Rockland. And she doesn't have a lot of background in reflection assignments and wants to promote more critical thinking and increased memory of material. Cherie from Binghamton, she's an instructional designer. Lori Shalit from Associate Director, Advisement and Transition. I don't see what institution though.
She's from Cortland.
Oh, okay. So says reflection is a critical component to our high impact practices for our student leaders, our TAs, and first year seminar programs. Certainly. I love the level of engagement from our TAs. This is through Blackboard, and I think sometimes that platform works well and students feel comfortable sharing, right? So I'm sure there are a lot of folks here working in an online environment. I personally, I've only taught online for the last few years, so I'd be curious on how to have students do that in an online environment. John Kane from SUNY Oswego is here. John is the CELT director, and he's an economist at Oswego, and he's used some reflection assignments in a variety of classes, and he's here to more about strategies you are suggesting. All right. So, and there's one more. Janine Noel Dada. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. And Jeff Berger from NYU Winthrop Hospital. Okay, folks outside of SUNY, excellent. And Clinical Campus of Stony Brook School of Medicine. Interested to hear more about developing reflective assignments for their learning communities, for their medical students. Interesting. All right, so I think I got everybody. Like I said, if anybody wants to speak up, just please raise your hand and I certainly will give you the permission to talk. So. Looks like we have a good, diverse group of folks here today, and it looks like there are 13 folks in now.
There is quite a variety, and sounds like there's a good variety in terms of where we would like reflection to go. One, if I could just click back to start us off, what Laura had mentioned in terms of reflection for writing. What might be some of the ways in which folks use reflection to move students past the idea of, well, what did I get out of this experience, general prompt? What kinds of more focused prompts do you use, whether it's a prompt for a spoken response or a written response, to zero in on some more nuanced understandings of their experiences?
Again, folks, feel free to put in the chat your thoughts about that question. Or raise your hand if you're brave.
maybe we can rephrase that prompt by asking, how do you connect your student learning objectives? How do you connect your reflection prompts to your student learning objectives, whether they are objectives geared toward something specific in the discipline or something that moves along more toward what we call soft communication skills, empathy. John, would you like to say something? Sure, I'll dive in.
There are a couple things in the chat. I don't know if you guys can see it, but
I'll need stronger glasses.
Okay.
I can read it.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah, why don't you go ahead? I don't want to hear just me.
Yeah. All right. So this is from Laura. That's a great question, John. One thing I try to do is to tell students that reflection is a way of learning to be consciously aware of their own thinking. But this requires an active imagination for seeing their thoughts objectively. That's very true.
Interesting.
Yeah. I know when I started doing reflective questions with my students in chemistry, there was a lot of resistance for the natural science majors. They thought, oh, reflection is touchy-feely stuff. Why are you asking me about my feelings? And I really had to reframe that in a reflection is not about your feelings. It's about what you're learning, why you're learning it, and how you're learning it, and then how can you apply it to something new. So
I don't know if you saw the comment right before that, but port WASG, I'm not sure that is. Sometimes I ask my students to tell me why what I just taught them is important to their future career.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's a great. And we're taking notes, so if you see us like look down, and we're taking notes. I don't know if they can see us.
They can.
But, okay, awesome.
So Keith, and actually I've been using this lately. I attended a webinar on this. Gina Merlis from MCC did a webinar for a group of us who do faculty development in Western New York. And Keith, this is from TLTC Purchase. He likes to use the what, so what, now what framework when helping faculty think about prompts. So getting students to distinguish among a description of what they did, what it meant, how it relates to the course or program, and then what they will change in the future. So kind of diagnosing what it is about, what are they reflecting on, and why it's important, but then what they're going to do with that reflection.
That's great.
It's a good prompt.
It's a really good prompt.
Do you see the next one there? I don't know if you want to read it, Vince. The reflect both in action.
No, I'm not seeing.
Okay, so I teach, and again, I don't know who's saying what, because sometimes when you come in, your name isn't on the Zoom list. But this person says, I teach what is important to reflect both in action, so real time, perhaps with a patient and things are not going as planned, and on action after a clinical encounter, asking what would you do differently. Important to have both. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah,
thanks, Jane.
Technical things. We had to scroll down on the chat. That was my problem. Oh, yeah.
Grading. Grading is always a challenge. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Laura Dunbar. One challenge I sometimes have is assigning grade weights to reflective exercises. Do people have thoughts about this?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, so we'd like to hear people have thoughts about this.
So in my classes, I have my students complete Stephen Brookfield's critical incident questionnaire. Those of you here that know me know that I talk about it all the time, and it's either weekly or biweekly, or you could do it once a semester or a couple times a semester. Just a series of reflective prompts. to get students thinking about the course and their progress in the course. And of course, it's hard to get them to do it unless you assign some kind of value to it in terms of a grade. But because it's anonymous, that's hard to do. So I just, usually give them some kind of extra credit or some way, some little token recognition that they've done it, even though I can't tie the person to the responses. So.
As part of a bear with me, I just cannot, I'm going to have to go in for new glasses, I think, because I cannot read some of the comments. But I see, if you don't mind me creeping up close to the screen and the camera, I do record a grade for reflection assignments. This is from Kirsty. I'm sorry, you would think that after she and I have worked together that I can pronounce her name. I do record grades for reflection assignments as part of a participation and/or as part of a journal assignment. Most are not anonymous.
Mine are not anonymous.
Mine are not. Thank you.
Yeah. And I want to read the one before that too. In The Slow Professor, they talk about a check minus, check plus system. I haven't used it yet. I'm not sure how to justify that in an evaluation rubric. Would also love some more suggestions on this from Sarah Porway. Yeah, in my own practices, it was actually just a binary. It's either done and acceptable or not done or unacceptable. And if it was not done, they'd have to do it. If it was not acceptable, they'd have to do it until I accepted it. But I didn't have a rubric. It was in my head, which was not very transparent to the students. And that was a little bit problematic.
In my English composition courses, and Kirsty, I think this links also with what you do, I provide a couple of samples so that students understand what I'm looking for. This helps them to distinguish between free writing and journal writing and reflection so that they understand, for example, in a reflection assignment, I am looking for the mechanical issues to be correct spelling, punctuation, and grammar. This is not free writing. But I also provide in that an idea that I am looking for students to make connections between specifics in their experience and specifics with regard to whatever it is we've been reading, writing about, connections between their experience and someone else's experiences. All of this with the understanding also that this kind of writing is very different from what they're used to, where they come out of high school with many students the traditional Baker essay model. And then this turns this on its head, where this is more inductive and they're moving from, at least in my class's cases, where students are working from the details and then adding up in almost a verbal mathematical way, add up to a conclusion based on the details. And so by the end of the semester, hopefully we have gotten to a point where their exploration of their experiences does provide some revelation. The point about distinguishing, am I skipping anyone? I hope not.
Yeah, the one before that was an interesting question, like grading on a rubric so that you can get students from sort of maybe very basic or I wouldn't say naive, but, it's very amateur. That's not even a good adjective, but, where you want to get them to one point to a more advanced point where they're really, hitting all those points. So does anybody use a rubric or anything like that? That was the question there. It's a good question.
Yeah, we see some posts from AACU has rubrics that are good for this as well. And then Keith posted a link to some rubrics from, looks like University of Iowa, that he's pointed at people in the past. So it looks like there's some out there. Now, will this chat list be available? Will that link be available?
Yes, what we usually do is we put it into a Google Doc, and then we'll just post that link in the YouTube the YouTube site where we have the recording.
Okay, great. All right, so I think this is helpful. I sort of want to move on. to frame a new question and get to a new prompt. So there's a handout that we're providing with this webinar, and it's just something we put together. We're by no means experts on this, and so we really want to get feedback and hear from everybody. But we thought the handout would help guide our discussions a little bit. So in that handout, we have a definition of reflection, and by means it's not the absolute definition, but we're curious what you all think about that definition and the characteristics. And we're really curious, the open prompt here is, what do you want reflection to do for your students? What do you want them to get out of the reflective assignments?
So I did just post the handout to a Google Drive link where they can get the handout. So if anybody has trouble getting that, just let me know and I'll try again. But that link should work.
Great.
Oh, sorry, I posted the link. Sorry guys, I shared it to all panelists and attendees. So here's the link.
Okay.
I only sent it to you. So there you go. Sorry about that.
But we're curious. I mean, what do you want students to get out of the reflection? I know when I started doing this, I was doing it for my independent research in chemistry, and I really wanted to know what students were getting out of the research experience beyond just collecting data, reporting data, and presenting data that they had collected. So one of the things I wanted to understand was, how were students really thinking about the research practice, and how were they applying scientific processes to what they were doing? That's really what got me very interested in doing reflection initially.
I'm just going to paste your definition in the chat too, just so folks have it there. And don't forget, folks, you can ask to speak if you don't.
We offer this document as a resource for reference later on, not necessarily as something that we need to read through at this point and slow down discussion. There are too many ideas already floating around. One of the steps that we have taken here at SUNY Cortland in, for example, our English composition courses, is to have a role play event either within a class or an outside of the class role play event. In one case, it takes a couple of hours, that serves as a source for reflection for students. So we have a state of poverty simulation, for example, that would link back to the theme in that particular course for that particular semester. And then students have a shared experience. This would be for a course in which, if you have 22 students, you have students doing any number of different community activities. 22 students might be spread across 10 or 12 different activities in the community. So they don't have a shared experience, which has some benefits. But to give them a shared experience, we put them into this simulation, and then they can be combining the experiences in the simulation with what they're doing on their own, with the coursework, to eventually come back to what in our case would be some way of understanding this concept of empathy. And this is one of the things that I tried to get out of some of our reflections was, In what ways are they empathizing? How does that empathy then translate into how you're tailoring a message to two different audiences, if that makes any sense? So you could be have as one audience someone in the business world or someone in government, and then someone who is with a not-for-profit. But you want that same message. You want them to take the same, take action in the same, for the same effect. But your message is going to be different. How does this help develop empathy?
So yes, it's interesting. So I've often thought of reflection as trying to understand, you know, who you are and sort of how you got there. So my context usually is working with faculty to help them reflect about their teaching practice. And again, I usually draw on the work of Stephen Brookfield, and he talks about critical reflection specifically as the process of hunting your assumptions about sort of teaching in that case, right? And why you teach the way you do, why you make the choices you make in the classroom, and trying to sort of understand those so that you are you know, a better teacher in the long run, right? So that you can make maybe different choices, or sort of understand better why you make the choices you do and how it ties to what you want your students to do. And so that what you just said sort of resonates with me, John, because it does sometimes mean that, for example, in a upper division capstone course, you need to you can't always teach the same way that you teach in a intro level course for first and second year students.
Gotcha. Can you read?
Yes, I can read this. So this is from Marnie. Goal: I added reflective exercise so students would learn to use past performance on quizzes to learn. Often students would just check their grades and not consider what they could learn from their performance on the quiz, which are designed to address major misconceptions and are full of answer explanations. In addition to helping them learn the course material, learning from feedback and mistakes is a lifelong skill I hope to help them recognize, give them a structure for doing so. That's awesome.
To focus on the learning.
Mm-hmm. And we have one from Danielle. I teach intermediate French courses, and reflections are an integrated part of these courses as we compare values, customs, family life, education, etc. of various French cultures and students' own cultures.
And Laura raised her hand. So Laura, do you want to go ahead? Go ahead.
Sorry, and I didn't realize I had my microphone muted too, which is not helpful. Thanks, Chris. So I just found your point really interesting about developing reflective practice among teachers, because a thing that I try to share with my students is that reflection is not just a thing, you know, that I require of them, that I do it as part of my own sort of research values and as part of my teaching practice, right? And so sometimes I think that sharing my own reflections with students sort of helps, you know, underline the idea of its ongoing value for them. Earlier in today's seminar, somebody mentioned that they help students reflect by emphasizing the importance of it for their careers, right? And I think for me, it's about modeling the behavior that I want, you know, to see them try to begin to perform, right? And also the idea of becoming a responsible, active, accountable learner, right, is important too, I think, when we talk about modeling our own reflections with students. You know, obviously it's something I do regularly, and so you're always, you know, in a process of becoming, right?
That reminds me of an experience just yesterday with there's a student who's a secondary ed social studies major. He and a colleague in the same class had come up with a community action plan that was based on an assignment given to him by Dr. Peterson here at Cortland. We were meeting with Greg Phelan, who is chair of chemistry department, and one of the questions that Greg had for the student was, based on the student had come up with a project for addressing what could be a high sodium chloride count in the city's water, especially for a woman who might be pregnant or for an individual with diabetes. Greg asked the student, well, what moral responsibility do you have now that you've identified this? And so here, bringing in this idea of philosophy, going back to, Laura, your idea about modeling the behavior here, Greg brought in some of his own experiences with regard to, you have an idea about a community project, you have the idea. What moral responsibility do you have to carry out that idea, and with whom? And other ideas that go along with it, making this more of a multidisciplinary approach to your individual responsibility as a citizen or a practitioner in your field.
You see the last question there in the chat? So someone talks about promoting a 1 minute journal activity for their first year students with this seminar program. And do you consider this activity a worthwhile activity? My hope is that the journal is indeed a reflective exercise and prompts our students to get comfortable with writing and also practice good reflection. Just wondering if you have a philosophy on the 1 minute journal activity.
I definitely have a philosophy on it, but I'd like to hear from others as well. And I guess this would go back to Lori as well, who posted that. Lori, I'm curious what you're getting out of that journal activity and what you think the students are getting out of that journal activity.
So that was Sarah Portway from SUNY Oneonta who posted that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so me and John are both squinting at the screen in the small font, just if you see the video.
I'm sorry, I was wrong. So Sarah posted that second comment about reading. Okay, I was jumping ahead. Chat's kind of hard to follow. Everyone's reflective writing often isn't sort of brief writing, right? So that's part of the problem.
I'm wondering, Lori, with regard to the 1 minute prompts, to what extent does that spark additional discussion during class?
Mm-hmm.
And this idea, again, also prompts different thought of different ways, different purposes for reflection.
I like that. Yeah, students don't always want to reflect.
They don't.
So the comment that Sarah put there is also a very interesting comment. She says she's having difficulties getting students to read. Please have another webinar about that. Great idea, maybe in the spring. Curious how to use a reflective practice to encourage them to read. I think this kind of ties in nicely with the 1 minute paper thing. This has been across institutions, and I know I'm not the only one. I'd rather give an incentive rather than punishments for reading, and I believe that reflection would help. However, when I run a variety of activities in class, every class I find they are unprepared to complete the activity, so it falls flat and doesn't help them as I would like it to. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. So how to use reflection to sort of engage students enough that they actually are prepared rather than just quiz them to death, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, in my own experiences, I've noticed that students are very resistant to reflection. And I think it's a lot of their initial hesitation is they don't understand why they're doing it or why it's important to do it. At my previous institutions, we'd use reflection to try and get students to connect what they did in one class, say an English class, to something that they did in a natural science class or a social science class, or really reflect across the curriculum. And students were very resistant to it, but the students that really got it really benefited from it. It just took a while to get there. So I understand about the punishment and trying to get students to do this, but it's really a practice, I think, that students have to just keep doing until hopefully they see the benefit of doing it. And I know this sort of just sounds like, you're learning how to do this for your own benefit. Education is good and all that, but it's worked well for me, and it's really just promoting it. And then I forgot who said this, but Laura said this about sharing her own experiences and ongoing value for developing reflective practices. I thought that was really spot on, is modeling this behavior ourselves of this is what I do to become a better instructor or a better practitioner. And I think sharing our own values helps us draw the students in. And we're getting more coming in.
I just can't read it.
Okay, I'll read the last comment that came in. This is from Laura Dunbar. I wonder if modality isn't an issue affecting resistance with reflection. I once had students reflect on a major assignment by videoing themselves talking about the experience. It's not necessarily practical for regular reflection, but they seem to enjoy the multimodal approach. That's a really good idea too.
Yeah, so one of the, to tie that back to the question about how to use reflection to encourage students to read more. So I don't know how many people here, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with the idea of exam wrappers. So it's a metacognitive strategy to get students to reflect on how they prepared for an assignment. And so, or an exam, typically an exam where you have a series of questions that they answer after they're done with their exam, so reporting on how often they studied or what their study strategy was, or did they do the reading and that sort of thing. So that's a type of reflection that, especially in an early exam, if you kind of work with students to sort of say, hey, you didn't read and you didn't do well, maybe next time you try reading, and then maybe that'll improve your performance on the next exam. I mean, that's simplifying things a bit, but. Overall strategy is right, tying reflection back to performance and tying it back to what they're going to do differently, right? If you just reflect without sort of tying it to action, it sort of just hangs there, right?
And I think an important prompt is also defining for the students what you want them to get out of the reflection. That's not just an exercise, but there's really meaning behind it. It helps as well. So I'm looking at the time as well. We've got about 20 minutes left, and this is all great, but I want to move on a little bit. The other thing that we wanted to share and discuss is the guidelines for constructing an assignment. And we've listed some ideas and some prompts on the handout, but thinking about what you want reflection to do for your students, the next natural question is, right, how do we get there? And we've talked about that a little bit already in this, and I'm curious about other ideas you all have about how do we get to the end goal of meaningful reflection from our students.
Would it be helpful if I shared that page of the handout on the screen, or do you want just everyone to look at it without doing that?
If you could post it, Chris, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure, I'll just put that up. There we go. Let's see if I can get it all in one screen.
Yeah, it's kind of a lot because we have a lot of we have a lot of fine details or different thoughts we got on there.
Well, folks just focus on the main, so purpose, assessment, construction, continuity, and coherence. I think that those are really helpful categories to think about.
Right. And it's really the idea is beginning at the end, right? First defining what the purpose of the reflection is, and then starting with that and then sort of backloading, okay, how are we going to get there? And then trying to scaffold different parts of the assignment to make sure you can get to the end goal that you want. And for a lot of students, reflection isn't a natural process. It's a skill that has to be developed. So the idea behind the scaffolding is to really give the students a framework where they can start, get a little bit of feedback perhaps, or a little bit of guidance before they really get into more of a meaningful and more developed reflection.
Yeah, this is really helpful. This handout.
And if you're posting it, I don't see it on the chat. We only have our chat window open.
Oh, I'm sorry. I actually shared my screen, so I have the actual. Yep. So, and it doesn't all fit on one screen. So.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yep. So, and I will post the handout again in the chat for those who maybe joined after I posted it last, as soon as I kind of exit out of this. So hopefully that gave folks enough time to see those steps. And I'm gonna share the handout again for those who perhaps didn't get a chance to get it last time. So I actually have a question. So, I tend to sort of use the same prompts, and it's hard to change once you kind of get ones that kind of seem to work. Do either of you sort of routinely kind of change the prompts that you use for reflection activities, or do you have sort of go-to ones, or how much should you be reflecting on your use of reflection, I guess is the question I'm asking.
Yeah, I think the feedback is important, and rethinking how to design the prompts. I'm going to be totally honest. When I started doing this for research, I changed the prompt a little bit, but not by much, because I could work individually with those students. When it was on a much larger scale institution-wise, the prompts really didn't change, but that was more of a function of I didn't have enough feedback to know how to make significant changes to the prompts. But I think it is important to really go back and continually redesign the prompts and be honest with your students about that as well. What's worked for me in teaching is getting feedback from student feedback, and then in the next class sharing that feedback and then telling the students why I'm changing the class the way I am. For example, which textbook I'm using, I would share, this is what students said about the previous textbook, and this is why I chose the new one. And also for assignments and due dates, and that worked well. So I do think redesigning the prompts is helpful, but I think letting students know your own thought process of why you did it is actually the real benefit for those students. And that helps to develop and demonstrate your own reflective practices.
Going back to the modeling idea.
Yeah.
And if I can go to Carolyn, is wondering about the about whether we share students' responses, their reflections with each other, or if those reflections are kept in confidence. How do you address that question? I'll mention that in my syllabi, I put in a note that all of students' writing is fair game. I don't use that phrase, but that all of their writing is available for public consumption within the class, but that if they do not want me to use something of theirs, just to let me know, and I remind them of that during the semester. At the same time, I will ask a student in confidence if the student would allow me to use some of their writing, whether it's a reflection or a part of an essay. And there are times when, even if I have that permission, I will quote the student but not use the student's name. So I have a variety of ways in which I can use students' comments.
All right, so we're getting a lot of, and Chris, everybody can see the chat, is that correct?
Yes, they can, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's so true about content. Kirsty's comment about that, really the confidentiality depends on the sensitivity of the content, that's for sure. I mean, my guess is that if they're reflecting on principles of chemistry or physics, not to pick on the sciences, it's not as sensitive as if you're in maybe a social work class or a counseling class where you're kind of thinking about your own sort of emotional development in relation to what you're learning, right?
I will say though that even when I did this in the natural sciences, I wouldn't share student responses. I might paraphrase without identifying a student, but oftentimes when I would ask, how did you learn what you learned, students would be sort of candid in some cases and sort of debasing themselves, and I felt that was something that I absolutely should not share. So even, going back to the natural sciences, even though it's natural sciences, it could still be something private that the student doesn't want shared. And my own practice is to not share. The other concern I sometimes have is when I was doing this institution-wide, some students would say, well, can I just see examples of good reflection? And I always hesitated because I didn't want students to copy. I wanted the reflection to really be an internal reflection. And I feel sometimes if we share too much from past results, future students think, well, if this is a grade attached or if this has a pass-fail attached to it, I need to do exactly what I'm told to do. And that's really not what I'm trying to get at.
And of course, there's always the concern that the student is telling us what they think we want them to tell us.
Right. The question that actually I had, and I haven't seen this come up yet, is that I think sometimes students sort of think that if they just share what they feel about a topic, and this is especially true of those of us teaching maybe in the social sciences or humanities, and that counts as reflection. And if you look back at your definition, that's really maybe how they feel is part of it, but it's really just one part. And so I was wondering if either of you had suggestions for kind of moving students past that sort of, this is how I feel, to that more purposeful process which they're trying to sort of develop, as you put it, or the definition says, a more nuanced understanding of an experience.
Some of that deals with trying to help the student feel uncomfortable in a particular situation so that the student starts to identify, and this goes back to earlier part of the discussion, it helps the student to identify some preconceptions and then try to match ways in which those, figure out where those preconceptions might have come from, and then to, over time, not necessarily in one reflection, but to figure out how she or he can justify those preconceptions, and maybe justify is the wrong word, so as to not have the student slap themselves upside the head, but just to figure out how I came to believe this, how does this match or not match with what I'm finding out now, and then make sense of it all and move on, forgiving one's self for having had a particular feeling, understanding why a person had she or he had a particular idea, understand that other people will probably have gone through that same process, and then continue on helping that critical thinking. But feeling on that discomfort might be part of it, that cognitive dissonance, as it were.
Yeah, and another question that was formulating as you were talking, John, is the, you hear a lot, and I don't know how much I buy into this, that, our current generation of, traditional age students are less willing to kind of go down those uncomfortable paths, learning paths, that they are not as, I don't know what the right word would be. I don't necessarily buy that, but I don't know. I was wondering what you think, over the years of doing this kind of work, if you found that you've had to change your strategy somewhat to sort of modify them to the more current generations of students, or if you feel like, listen, there's a way to do this, and I don't care if you're, again, 20 or 50, it's a similar kind of model.
I think we all try to adapt, whether it's to the nature of our students, what might be important to them, or even, and this is an old dog talking, trying to use technology. As Blackboard has come up, for example, and there's certainly other tools that students have with their smartphones, they could probably be teaching me, I'll just focus on myself, they could be teaching me how their smartphones could be used as a tool for reflection.
Yeah, Kirsty just posted a link to that book by the executive director of the organization at FIRE organization, Greg Lukianoff, about the coddling of the American mind. And I haven't read it, so I'm not going to say anything about it, but that's sort of what I was talking about in my comment. Yep. This is hard work, so students are able to do this like that. That's what I think. I mean, not reflecting is a lot easier than reflecting, right? And just kind of plugging away, not, reflection is hard work.
Yeah.
Yeah, VoiceThread is a good tool. I use VoiceThread in my classes, but I don't make them do a audio or a video post, so most of them just resort to text. So maybe I just need to change my practice and not the tool. So we have 5 minutes left. I want to give you guys an opportunity to say a few closing words or invite others to say closing words.
We're hoping that this might be the start of a mini learning community of practice with regard to reflection, that in some way we might be able to update each other on some of the steps that we have taken to improve our own use of reflection for ourselves and or with our students. Chris, is there, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, well, one thing I could do is when I do post this, I'm going to post the recording in the Faculty Development Community of Practice Workplace group. Those of you that are not in that workplace group, yeah, you can just reach out to me directly, and I can make sure you get in there, and maybe we can use that space to, for those who are interested in continuing the conversation, you can continue it there, and if it necessitates, anybody can create a group in Workplace. So there could be a developing reflection assignments or a reflection in college teaching and learning group in Workplace, where you can all kind of form a community of practice and continue to talk and share ideas and resources, activities.
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, one of the things we're thinking about is really just scratching the surface of reflection. And one of the next ideas might be thinking about how we could take feedback or assess the reflective prompts to build it in and design better prompts or better reflective practices.
Yeah, it'd be great if folks can just have that group to, again, be willing to share an assignment that they have, and we could create a workplace group, and it could be a kind of repository for reflective assignments.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And I did put my email address in the chat, so anybody who would like to get into workplace, just let me know, and I'll. Everybody can get in with their campus ID and password. Usually, sometimes there's some technical issues that have to get ironed out, but I can help you work through those if there are.
I will say from my own experiences, I started doing reflection not knowing what I was doing, and it was really attending workshops like this and participating in seminars and small group discussions that I learned a lot about reflection, and it's really informed my own practices and processes.
Same here.
So I'd really like to keep this conversation going and just understand that, you know, I am definitely not an expert and can always learn from my peers. So sharing is really helpful. Yeah.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both. I know you know, John said you have a 2 o'clock, and I do too. So we want to end on time. Like I said, I will be posting this recording soon in Workplace. And if anybody like to get it directly, you can just email me, and I'll send you the link. But thank you.
Sorry, Chris. We would like to thank everybody for joining in, because this has been a wealth of information for Vincent, for me as well. I'm running out of ink with so many notes.
Great.
Yeah, great.
Right,
Thank you all.
Thanks to everybody for being here. Enjoy the rest of your semester and have a great holiday.
You too.
Thank you. You too.